we have a few questions, and I'll take them at the end. I'll just like to invite the participants to send their questions, because after Dr. Mehran's presentation, we'll start taking up all the questions we have and start with the question and answer session. And with that, especially because of the fact that Dr. Mehran is specialized on warlordism and peace building, especially in Afghanistan, that is where you ended, Mr. Foxley. So I didn't intended to have this bridge, but thank you for giving it to me. Madam Mehran, you have the floor.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Yes, great. Thank you very much. Thanks for EFSAS for inviting me and for this very timely panel. And I have to admit, it's extremely difficult to speak after such brilliant panelists. And most of the points that I wanted to raise, they've already been discussed. Nonetheless, what I wanted to discuss about the whole situation here is analyzing the Taliban, the whole movement of the Taliban and their rise in power and the challenges they're facing from more of an violent non-state actor who gains territory. The perspective of and the literature on violent non-state actors, VNSAs, and who gain territory and who want to maintain territory, and the kind of governance that they want to offer to the people, the government they want to establish. So for as a violent non-state actor, now a terrorist group in some regard based on some lists, and an insurgent group based on other definitions of the Taliban. There are certain conditions that have led to the strengthening of the Taliban and the rise of the Taliban that have been discussed by co-panelists, particularly Ms. Mehran discussed it in detail, is that a weaker state was in place in Afghanistan. It was discussed that led to the rise of the Taliban, the state failure to provide security, particularly in the rural areas of the country in Afghanistan, that the Taliban could manage to step in, and the government's failure to actually improve the life of population in general, the rural population in Afghanistan. And rampant corruption was a major issue in Afghanistan that has led to the disenchantment of a lot of the population in the country and strengthening of the Taliban. The grievances built on these eventually led to either increasing the Taliban supporters or their empathizers and sympathizers, who essentially, even if the people were not on the side of the Taliban, they did not want to take a side and fight for the government, fight for the republic that they saw it was so corrupt that they could not tolerate anymore. And as Dr. Van Dam also very rightly mentioned, the regional dynamics and the regional aspect of this issue, that the role of Pakistan and ISI in supporting the Taliban from after they were ousted from 2003 onwards, and they were strengthened 2003 and 2004, rising up again and fighting, becoming a major challenge for the international troops and the Afghan government. So all of these factors led to the point that Taliban started taking control of the territory in Afghanistan. One province, one city after another fell to the Taliban, and there wasn't much military resistance because of this, because of all the aforementioned factors. Now, once in control of a territory, a VNSA has to balance between predation and provision of services. They have to balance between using violence and providing services for the population. And the Taliban, in claiming governance, they have to provide certain services for the population. Otherwise, they're facing major uprising challenges, uprising people as challenges to their government. Now, the Taliban has, in terms of provision of services, right now, we do see there are major issues that the Taliban is facing right now in the country. Healthcare sector in Afghanistan is on the verge of collapse. Hundreds of clinics and hospitals are being closed in the country right now. The economy of Afghanistan is collapsing. The value of Afghani has depreciated significantly since the Taliban has taken over Afghanistan. The banking system is crippled right now. They put a mullah, a religious scholar, as the head of the Afghanistan Central Bank. And then we get reports that actually there are some Pakistani national advisors there who are trying to replace the former, at the central bank, the former Afghan Afghan officials in the bank, in the central bank in Afghanistan. And there's a humanitarian crisis in Afghanistan unfolding right now. The prices of essential foods and goods have skyrocketed. And the Taliban cannot levy tax. They cannot fill in the state administration positions with their people who are actually capable of carrying those tasks. The Taliban has put some of their, before announcing their government, they've put some of their members in controlling as the head of ministerial lines in provinces, but they have no knowledge of how to run those services. They have no knowledge and skills to actually offer those services and function. So what their solution has been, they're encouraging former government employees, some of them, to join. At the same time, they've told them in provinces that the Taliban is not able to pay their salaries because the Taliban doesn't have money. The Taliban is actually not even able to pay the salary of their own fighters, based on some reports that we hear. While they're doing this, the government, I can't really call it the government of Taliban at this point, the Taliban spokesperson is announcing over and over that Afghans should not leave the country. The capable Afghans should, who have skills, they should not be leaving the country. They should actually remain behind and try to build this country. At the same time, they are actually putting a lot of restrictions on the population. On one hand, they do need this capable, educated, skilled Afghan generation of Afghans who are essentially the human capital of the country, and the future of that Afghanistan depends on them. At the same time, they're putting restrictions such as dress codes, such as what women can do and cannot do. Women are, on one hand, okay, you do not go to the airport trying to escape the country. At the same time, well, wear this particular type of burqa, you cannot appear in public. Or that in some provinces in the country, some provinces in Afghanistan, they actually beat people up, beat women up if they're not abiding by those dress codes. Now, right now, the eye of the world is essentially on the Taliban, but that focus has been generally on Kabul. What we hear, the stories we hear from other provinces of the country are horrendous. The type of justice, for example, that is provided by the Taliban, it is they execute, they have been cutting people's hands in public. They beat people up. They, even in Kabul and other provinces, in other cities, they are searching door to door for former government employees, particularly National Directorate of Intelligence and Security in Afghanistan. So what they're doing at the same time, on one hand, they're offering these the narrative of tolerance, the narrative of we allow women to work, or we will allow women to gain an education, but in reality, their behavior says something totally different. And we saw this also from forming the government that they recently announced, the caretaker government that the Taliban announced, and it was also discussed at various points by co-panelists, that looking at that, it's very clear and obvious that it's very exclusive. There are only very few number of non-Pashtuns on that list of the Taliban's government. They have there's absolutely no ideological diversity. There's all mullahs, sheikhs, religious scholars, Maulawis, one after another, who are basically in line, hardcore Taliban, in line with the Taliban's ideologies. As expected and predicted, and very unfortunately, there are no women there. And to be honest, that was expected from the Taliban. No matter how often there were discussions of Taliban reformed, Taliban version 2.0, nonetheless, that was what I expected from the Taliban. No women on their any of the cabinets, and the future of Ministry of Women's Affairs is unknown. They haven't spoken about it at all. In terms of human rights situation in the country, we know that women's education, although they've opened up certain, they've allowed universities to open up, but with very strict conditions that some universities might not be able even to meet those conditions. I know for a fact in Herat, they've told the university professors that there should be total separate classes for women and men, and then the female students should be only taught by female professors. And now, how many female professors do we have in Afghanistan and in provinces and cities like Herat? Not that many. And when that point was actually raised in a meeting with the Taliban said, well, that's not our problem. We had 20 years to get women to that stage. So that was the expectation and the explanation that the Taliban provided. On one hand, we do not allow women to gain an education. On the other hand, you make it happen. This is the same logic that actually we heard from the Taliban before. When I was in Afghanistan, when the first time around they took over the country, they closed down all the schools and they would not allow women to gain an education. In terms of healthcare sector, they did allow women to carry on with their jobs, which they did this time around as well. But at the same time, then and now, there is no prospect of education, not as much for women who want to gain that knowledge and become physicians and then go to work. So the Taliban is struggling with their own logic, with their own controversial and controversies and contradictory rationality that they expect something at the same time their rules and regulations are preventing the same thing that they want the population to that undermines the same expectation from the Taliban. And so these are some of the major challenges in terms of governance, in terms of provision of services that the Taliban is trying to provide for, if they are trying to provide those services for the population. And going back to Taliban's government, we'd already discussed that a number of these names on the list of the Taliban are actually blacklisted. These are, it is interesting to see that a group takes over a country and puts people in ministerial positions, in positions of power, who are on the on multiple terrorist blacklists, and that is going to undermine Taliban's position at the international scene and engagement with international community, because, and this is putting also countries, Western countries, international community, NGOs, the UN, in a very difficult position, that how are they going to interact with these with the Taliban's leadership if they already have put them on their if they're already on the terrorist list. So that is another major challenge for the Taliban if the Taliban wants to actually gain diplomatic recognition. Now, when it comes to the question of resistance, and the other challenge that Taliban is facing is resistance, armed resistance or civil resistance that the Taliban is currently facing. And my panelists and Mr. Foxley also mentioned that in terms of women's rights, women's groups facing, forming this resistance that the Taliban did not expect, that was not expected from Afghan women. They thought that the Taliban was actually, when they take power, that people probably, like the first time around in mid-90s, that they took power, people would accept what they would say or do not challenge them as much, because the first time around, and anytime anybody raised their voice, they would be put in jail, and people were beaten up on the streets. But this time around, with the help of technology and social media, this voice of resistance by the people, women's groups in particular, who are spearheading this resistance, it is very difficult for the Taliban to actually silence that. And that was not what the Taliban expected. And now they're facing this issue that they have to overcome. And as Mr. Foxley also mentioned, there was armed resistance. Now the relationship is reversed. Now the tables have turned around. The Taliban is in position of power, and the resistance, the Panjshir Valley resistance, and then the Ahmad Massoud, the son of late Ahmad Shah Massoud, announced that they would launch a guerrilla warfare in Afghanistan. Now, I'm not obviously not in favor of violence, but then analyzing this, you would see that guerrilla warfare, the tactics that the Taliban used on the previous government of Afghanistan is going to be used by their opponents right now, by their rivals, against the Taliban itself. Unless the Taliban realizes that they are in that situation and this can actually be the end of their control in Afghanistan and become inclusive towards the rest of the population, the rest of the political groups in Afghanistan, then the Taliban would have a very difficult time controlling Afghanistan, because the previous Afghan government, with the support of NATO forces and the US forces, could not manage actually to bring the whole of Afghanistan under its control, and the Taliban was resorting to these guerrilla warfare tactics that managed to actually eventually wear out the Afghan government and international forces. Now they are on the other side of the issue, and the same thing can happen to the Taliban. And going back to this whole, and as a closing remarks as well, that once a terrorist group or a violent non-state actor gets the control of the territory, the challenges they are facing in terms of governance, in terms of human rights, then do they change behavior? They need to change their behavior and rhetoric. Because if they do not change their behavior and rhetoric, that would essentially lead to them as a proto-state and another failed state, and they're bound to failure. Now, the Taliban, in terms of rhetoric, for example, they have a very strong PR campaign. They do say what the world wants to hear from them. And they do know that the eyes of the world is onto them and everybody's watching them. All eyes are on the Taliban, and they do realize that. They have actually passed statements and forbid their Taliban commanders to actually give interviews on TV. They've clamped down on some of the journalists who are covering the recent protests and resistance and rallies in the country. They fear that news would get out and tarnish the image that the Taliban leadership is trying to build. However, although on one hand, as I mentioned, that this technology, access to technology, access to social media has actually helped civil resistance against the Taliban. On the other hand, there are fears that once the Taliban actually strengthens its grip on Afghanistan, it might also limit people's access to social media. It might be able, right now, the Taliban might not have the bandwidth to deal with that side of the challenge that they are facing. But as we see in other countries in the region, Iran for one, Russia for another, the Taliban might manage to silence that voice as well and limit people's access to those technological advances. And the Taliban also had a narrative and a rhetoric of preventing Afghanistan from becoming another safe haven for terrorist organizations. In behavior, in action, they've shown so far not any sign of complying to that promise that they made. The Taliban released thousands of incarcerated terrorist or members from various terrorist organizations when they took over Kabul. There were TTP, Tehrik Taliban of Pakistan, Al-Qaeda members, some ISIS members that they released. They welcomed them. They took selfies with some of these terrorists and welcomed them all. And the Taliban cabinet, the caretaker government, shows that how much they care about the concerns of the rest of the world about terrorist actors and organizations not being active in Afghanistan. They have people, Haqqani network, part and parcel of the Taliban government right now. Four major positions have been given to Haqqani people, various people from Haqqani network, and there are already millions of dollars, $5 million, for example, reward given on any information on the whereabouts of those actors. So how is Taliban going to negotiate and talk and get engaged with a dialogue with the Western countries, particularly the US, if characters and leaders they have in their government are essentially on terrorist lists, and the blood of thousands of people are on their hands? The Taliban would have a very tough road to go because of these issues. Their rhetoric being one thing and the actions they're doing another thing. At the same time, internally, they're facing major resistance, from civil resistance, and also potentially it could what seemed to be also a guerrilla war that they might face as another challenge. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Mehran. I think it was a very good decision to let you speak at the end, because I've been listening all the time, and it's one of the most passionate calls for peace and someone's country I've heard in a long time. You also mentioned, and very rightly so, the human capital. Well, you are one of the examples of the human capital who went away because of the Taliban. So I can very much understand that there are people who would really like to do something for Afghanistan, and who also have been going back in the last 20 years, and now because of these restrictions, they feel put into a corner, because you can only do so much as long as you stay alive, and you can live your life, and that is something which is becoming increasingly difficult under the Taliban. Especially, you also mentioned that they're facing resistance, and they're very good in giving out the right messages currently to the West. I do wonder whether they will treat this resistance the same way when they are able to shut down internet and social media, because then it might not reach to us what exactly is happening. And I fear for going back to, because they are now already starting, I think we saw a few of these protests led by women where they were using rods, and that they're doing while they know this will come onto the world and social media. I wonder, and I fear what they will do when they cut down internet, um, and fearing for the fact that we might go to what happened 25 years ago in the Kabul stadium, the public executions which we had, or the stonings of women. Thank you very much for your presentation, and I think we would definitely like to hear more from you.